Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I consider this image as kind of an icon of my work. For a long time, I've been trying to understand the process of the kind of assembly line process of creating and recreating the labor inputs into the paid economy, as it were. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. What I want to convince you of, and this is more of actually, rather than a presentation of some specific research results, it's more of a recruitment strategy. Trying to attract more people to what I think is a really interesting kind of research paradigm that has some really important policy implications. So I want to try to persuade you that we need to develop an accounting system that allows us to measure the value of non-market work, but also look at interfamily transfers and net taxes in addition to market income and wealth over the life cycle. And that if we develop an accounting model, it would really transform the way we think about a lot of really important economic policy issues. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to kind of set the stage and get us kind of an intellectual sync. And then I'm going to show you one equation, the basic components of the accounting model, and give you several policy relevant applications. And we don't have to go through all of them today. I'm happy to be entertain questions along the way. I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, so I may stop a little bit short of the actual slides that I have. So, as I think most sociologists are keenly aware, economists generally have treated the family as kind of a realm of altruism. It's very separate from, very insulated from the market. And until recently, the family was kind of a black box. But it's not just the family that is kind of a black box in economic theory. Treatment of government transfer payments is quite similar. They're treated just as transfer, not as actual contribution for any productive activity. And in our national accounting system, we don't differentiate between government spending that's consumption and that which is investment. So if you're interested in kind of the intellectual history of this kind of treatment of women in the family, you can find a more detailed treatment in this book. This is a picture, this is a watercolor by William Blake, and you probably recognize it, something like Eve and the Garden of Eden. But what's different about it, you can see, is that the snake is actually more like a dragon, and it looks rather more magnificent and less evil. And it's Eve in the foreground, and Adam in the background seems to have been knocked out. So it's kind of a illustration of trying to look at economic theory from a little bit less androcentric point of view. So in case you were wondering where that notion of the black box came from, this is an early national income accounting text that shows the household, and you can see it's not actually a black box, but it's a dark gray box. And you're not really looking at what goes on inside it. So why is that? What's the what's the history of that tendency to view the household as a non-economic entity that should be excluded from national income accounts? Well, I think it goes back a long way to the classical political economy. And it's really John Locke who first articulated a labor theory of value. He argued that men should have rights, control over the products of their labor, because that would create incentives for them to work hard. And this is an important part of liberal political theory. And in addition to owning the products of their labor, he argued every man should enjoy self-ownership or autonomy. So that was a very important critique of the feudal relations, of aristocratic heritage, and some aspects of the patriarchal tradition in England. But if you think about Locke's principle, and this will come up again in a brief discussion on Marx, there's a little bit of a contradiction here, because if everybody should have control over the products of their labor, but everybody should also have control over their own person, it's going to create really serious problems in this theory if people are themselves produced, because it raises those two principles come into contradiction. If parents, by producing children, have control over the products of their labor, they violate that principle of autonomy or self-ownership. So that's just an example of why there's some pretty complicated intellectual maneuver in the paradigm that emerges from it. So in 1960, Pierre Schrafe, in a very important kind of mathematical tour de force, showed that the Marxian theory of value really could be rendered mathematically tractable in some ways that are pretty, not really worth going into here. But I love it. I've always been irritated that he called this really important contribution the production of commodities by means of commodities. Because that title kind of embodies the notion that is very much part of the Marxian labor theory of value as well as the Lockean labor theory of value, that workers are not themselves produced, that they kind of come from outside of the economic system. So that's why I titled my talk The Reproduction of People by Means of People. It's kind of it's a little bit of a jab at kind of Piero Schwab's. Although you'll see in some ways, I think there's some elements of the classical thinking about the labor theory of value that are actually useful. So I'm not throwing the whole thing out. I think there's a little bit of an insight there. And so the best way for me to explain this insight is to tell you this little story. It's a little imaginary counterfactual. Imagine that corporations don't hire workers, but they purchase robots that require new batteries every week. We're not that far away from this world. It's coming down the pipe pretty quickly, okay? So just putting on your, economic reasoning hat, how much would you have to pay for a robot? Well, in a long-run competitive equilibrium, you're going to have to pay at least as much as it costs to produce it, right? Okay? But what if there are people out there that just love making robots? They just make robots that are really cute and adorable, and they get satisfaction from it. Turns out especially women really love robots. Modern robots like this Sony Asiba robot are actually made to look a little bit like children, I think, to make them seem less threatening. Don't you find that robot model and that pose very, I think it is in fact playing on the child metaphor. Okay, so you get my point. If some people are kind of willing to do it for free, that lowers the cost to an employer. It means the employer only has to pay for the batteries. So what are the batteries? Batteries are just wages. And what do the wages do? They enable the worker to come, go home, eat dinner, go to sleep, and come back to work the next day. Okay? So it's obviously not that simple because you do actually, corporations do pay taxes, and taxes do help pay for some inputs into the robots and the people, right? But I think you get my point that there is a sense in which the labor theory of value kind of does suggest that this disconnect between the world of creating workers and selling commodities really needs to be explored. So another way to think about this, you could think about producing children or taking care of the elderly as a little bit like the services of Mother Nature. And what's really important about this is I want you to recognize that this is an argument about motivation. I'm not operating in a neoclassical utility maximization room here. Not that I think that's unimportant or uninteresting, it's just different. We're looking at the actual consequences of a set of services that are provided outside the market. So Mother Nature isn't maximizing her utility when she ensures a stable climate or in which she replenishes the stocks of ocean and the stocks of fish in the ocean, blah, 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 blah. But our ability to harvest or extract resources that are unpriced clearly affects the price that we charge for the goods that we produce with them. And I'm just thinking, I want you to think about labor in the same way. So it's really very similar, and the accounting procedure of valuing non-market work is very similar to principles of environmental accounting, where you look at what it would cost you to purchase a replacement for a set of ecological services or scarce resources. And you see this all the time in estimates of what the future cost of global warming or ocean acidification will be. Okay. So there's a little bit of recognition of this connection between production and reproduction in the human capital literature. But a lot of the human capital literature is about self-investment in education. Now there's more about family investment and what the outcomes are going to be. And a lot of work, really interesting and valuable work being done here in this very building on the inputs into children and to child outcomes. But what we don't really have is a theory of how these inputs into children connect to the larger economy in terms of the overall amount of money or the overall amount of labor time that is going into them. And we also notice that human capital itself may be very valuable, but the people who put a lot of time and effort into creating and maintaining human capital, people who are taking care of children or people who are taking care of the elderly, don't typically capture those benefits. So there's what you might call an incentive alignment issue in the human capital economy, where people are providing these services largely out of a sense of intrinsic motivation or altruism, but they're suffering a pretty significant economic penalty that may be affecting the evolution of those altruistic preferences or not. So there are a lot of different ways you could conceptualize it, and I think there's a lot of interesting work going on in trying to figure out how to conceptualize it. You could call it an externality, that raising a really great child who gets a scholarship to come to Princeton and then makes a great scientific discovery, that those parents are creating this positive externality for the system. You could also talk about negative externalities when parents do a bad job with kids, and that imposes some costs on society as a whole. You can think of it as a property rights problem, and there's some work that argues that there's actually an economist who argues that we should totally transform the social security system and instead give parents a legal right to garnish their children's paychecks directly. Why? Because that would solve the incentive alignment problem. So if your child grows up and is successful, earns a lot of money, then you get more money in old age. Right. So that's the way economists think. It's kind of shocking, but it's thought-provoking. I hope you'll find it thought-provoking. You could also see it as kind of an incomplete markets problem, and even Gary Becker, who I think is a very market-centric economist, acknowledges that there are incomplete markets. Children cannot, unborn children cannot make bids to parents. If you'll conceive me and bring it up, I'll pay you this money. So there's a missing market there. Children don't choose to be born, and they don't choose their parents. If it's not a market, that's also another example of the way economists think. Okay, so in an accounting framework, in an introductory economics class, much is made of a circular flow. And the circular flow is showing that, households spend money from businesses, and they go to work in businesses and earn income, and that comes back to the household. And then they pay taxes to government, and they get services from government, and then businesses pay taxes, and businesses get services from government. And there are transfers from government to households, but as I mentioned before, these are not construed as anything in return for services rendered. They're just transfers, so they're not actually treated as a contribution to GDP. So let's look at an alternative picture. I think this is a much more realistic picture of the circular flow. The whole market economy and also household economy is embedded in an ocean. You could think of that ocean as literally an ocean. You could think of it as the atmosphere. It's the environment. There's extraction of unpriced resources from the environment, and then there's deposition of waste into the environment. And we have not measured those very accurately, but we're beginning to measure them accurately because we have figured out that if we don't, it's going to affect outcomes in the part of the economy that we do measure. Okay, so there's still a market in the circular flow. These red arrows are the transfers that were emphasized in the preceding chart, but you've noticed I've made them very small, very slender, and partly because I'm suggesting that, in fact, they are empirically quite small compared to the transfer of these unpriced resources. And more importantly, for what I'm going to talk about today, in the household, there are some very significant transfers taking place of both money and time. So men are transferring money to women. Women are transferring money back to men. They're pooling income in the household. Same thing with time. Same thing with children. Parents are spending a lot of money and time on kids, and they're getting some of that back in the form of assistance later in old age or not. And yet we don't really have a very systematic accounting system to really understand this larger circular flow. And I think we do need that in order to solve some pretty important problems. So the first thing I want to talk about is measuring time and assigning a value to the time that people spend in work activities. Just defining work as activities that you could, in principle, pay somebody else to do for you. And I picked this illustration because I think it's very beautiful. It's called a tempogram, and what it does is it shows you for one country. I'm going to ask you in a minute if you can guess what country it is. It shows you the percentage of people who are engaged in a certain activity in the country as a whole on a representative day. So at 4 a.m., most people are in the blue zone, and the blue zone is sleeping. And then gradually people wake up. Okay, so by 8 o'clock, many fewer are sleeping, and some have started to do household work, and some have started to do market work or studying. Okay, so the white bar is the white area is eating, and you notice this is a very important activity in this country in the middle of the day and also in the early evening. So this is a very prominent. And does anybody want to guess what country? Spain. It's close. It's France. The Spanish tempogram is quite similar, but the French actually seem to linger even longer periods. The Spanish tend to eat a little bit later in the afternoon and in the evening. But what I really want to emphasize, apart from the beauty of this tempogram, is that the space here of work and study, that area is roughly similar in magnitude to the area of household work. And that's true in most countries in the world. It's true in the US today. The American Time Study survey, very, very, very good data. 50% of all work, again, defined as what you could pay somebody else to do for you. Has nothing to do with how you feel about it, whether you like it or don't like it, or feel irritated by it or not. It's just, could you in principle hire somebody to do it for you? So quantitatively speaking, we're talking about a huge amount of human energy that's being devoted to non-market work, even in a really developed country like the United States. So I think it's really important to measure values of time, and I've learned talking to sociologists that I sometimes get a very negative response. So I'm going to inoculate against this response. Okay, I am not romanticizing housework. I am not succumbing to commodity fetishism. This is not an act of economic imperialism. Some of my best friends are sociologists. My own friends, in fact. It's an accounting problem. It's just an accounting problem. And the accounting problem is non-market work, interfamily transfers, and government transfers, all very large relative to market income. So let's look at how large they are. Okay, this is the basic mother equation, and it's really simple. We're just going to take income and define income as extended income rather than market income, and we're going to say that rather than just treating income as wages times the hours of market work, we're also going to add in the value of household production. So that's some approximate replacement cost wage times the hours of household work. Plus, we're going to look at net family transfers, which can take the form of money or time. So this component here is hours of household work done on own account for yourself. And that which you do for other people would be embedded in this equation, which could be disaggregated. And then we're going to add to that the value of government transfers. And we're going to look at this over the life cycle rather than just at one point in time. We can also look at it in one point in time. So this is a simplified version. I've left out the environment just because we're not going to focus on that for now, but you could in principle add in a factor for the environment to be consistent with the previous slides. And I'm also going to leave out income from capital just so that you don't have so many terms to look at. So I don't think there are any consequences that follow from that. Everybody okay with this basic idea? Okay. So now let's talk about why this matters. So I'm just going to walk you through some examples of why it's not just an accounting exercise. So let's say you compare two married couple families with two children under the age of 4. Both couples earn the same annual market income of $30,000 a year. So again, just for simplification, ignore taxes, ignore transfers, and we're going to ignore interfamily transfers. we're just going to focus on the time devoted to unpaid work in these households, okay? So the difference between family A and family B is that family A, the $30,000 of market income is earned by one person, and another adult is at home spending 40 hours or more a week doing activities like childcare, preparing meals, shopping, doing errands, and so forth and so on. In family B, same market income, but both adults are earning $15,000 apiece, and they have much less time to devote to household work. Okay, so which family do you think has the higher living standard? And I'm not talking about happiness or utility or state of mind. I'm just talking about, you know, kind of purchasing power. Which family would you rather be in? Which family are you in? There's a difference between the two. If, you know, family B basically has fewer resources because they have less time. They're earning, you know, the value of their work per hour is less. So there's several ways that this could affect them. They might just consume less. Like they might not, their house might not be as clean. They might not spend as much time reading aloud to their children. Stuff like that. Or they could actually end up working longer hours and having less leisure time. That's another possibility. But they're going to probably have to spend some of their market income buying substitutes for the things that family A can provide on its own. And the really expensive substitute is going to be buying childcare. And the purchase of that childcare is going to be a significant portion of that $30,000, right? So these families have very, very different standard of living. But in our analysis of income and income growth and income inequality in the US, we treat them as though they're exactly the same. And that creates some pretty significant distortions in our picture of the evolution of living standards. So now, here's a simple extension of this. It also affects the way that we think about income inequality. Okay, so not these levels of family income, but inequality in extended income, or what we're calling here living standards. Okay, so to go back to that equation, we're just looking at this term, which is the value of household work compared to this term. So the variance of this red term is a lot smaller than the variance of the blue term, because actually the amount of time that people spend on household work doesn't vary that much. And the replacement wages that we use to assign for household work vary somewhat, and I generally favor a very disaggregated approach with a vector of wage rates. But there's still just less variation in the replacement costs of household activities than there is in wages. Okay, so basically, this term has an equalizing effect on the overall distribution of living standards. So as this term becomes smaller, and that term becomes smaller, and this term becomes bigger, you're going to get an increase in the overall variance of living standards. So let me just warn you, there's a complicated, sort of confusing thing here. If in the cross section you took the distribution of income in the US today, market income, and you said, what does it look like if we added in the value of household work, that would have an equalizing effect. There would seem to be less inequality because that would have a buffering effect. Okay. But if you're comparing income distribution in 1950 with income distribution today, in addition to the fact that market income has become more unequal, there's also been a movement of married women into paid employment, a reduction in total hours of household work, and an increase in hours of market work. And so that has the effect of accentuating the trend or the change in the value of that non-market household work. So we would arrive at a different picture, you know, sort of a more positive picture of income inequality in the cross-section. Things aren't as bad as they look. But a worse picture of trends that actually things have gotten much more unequal than they were. And I think that is a really important, has really important implications for thinking about inequality. Okay, maybe we'll just do two more examples and then stop and have a discussion. The United Nations Human Development Report has a lot of indicators of standard of living and human development other than gross domestic product. And I think these are very useful measures. There's a Gender Human Development Index, and there's also a Gender Empowerment Measure. And it's really interesting to look at how countries are ranked in terms of these indicators. But one shortcoming of these indicators is that, especially the Gender Empowerment Measure, is that they're kind of measuring how successfully women participate in men's sphere. Okay, which is a good thing. I think we really want to know that. So, what are women's market earnings relative to men? What's their participation in professional and managerial occupations relative to men? And what's their representation in government relative to men? That's really good. But what we're not paying attention to or monitoring is to what extent are men now doing more housework because their wives are doing more market work? To what extent are fathers contributing to the support of kids more or less than they did before women were earning more? And so another way to think about this is that women are earning more and have more professional opportunities, but in a lot of countries, not every country, but in a lot of countries, and especially in the US, we know that women are supporting more dependents than they used to. So that's what a rise in the number of families maintained by women alone means, is that more women are supporting children without very much help from the fathers of their kids. And that trend seems to be partly associated with increases in women's labor force participation. So what we're seeing is that you can think of it in terms of this part of the equation as FI, inter-family transfers. So yes, women are doing better here because they have more hours of market work at higher wages, but that FI is not as big as it used to be because they're getting less support for their non-market work from men than they had in the past. And I think that's actually a pretty significant cross-country trend. Okay, this is my favorite because we're approaching Tax Freedom Day. How many people here know what Tax Freedom Day is? The Tax Foundation gets a lot of publicity, usually sometime between now and April 15th, based on the following thought experiment. If you, starting January 1st, knew what all the taxes that you're going to owe for the year were, and you devoted your entire paycheck to paying off those taxes, you know, because you're like a serf in a feudal system in which you've been enslaved, and you're at the mercy of this burgeoning, you know, bureaucratic kleptocracy. At what point are you free? If you did nothing but pay, at what point will you be free of taxes, liberated, so that you can control your own money, as everybody knows you should? Right? Well, okay, overall, taxes in the U.S., adding up federal, state, and local taxes, they come to about a third of personal income. So, not surprisingly, about a third of the way through the year, right? If you devote your paycheck to taxes, you will be free of taxes. And this little metaphor has gotten a lot of political traction, and I think it's contributed to kind of a larger sense of resistance to taxes. So I want you to think instead about an alternative thought experiment that's very much based on thinking about this equation and this term here, this G term here, okay? Think about what year is tax payback year. So on average, how much money has the government spent on children until they reach the age at which they become employed and start paying back taxes into the system? So what we're doing here is we're taking all the accumulated debt and we're adding it up at a very low interest rate, but a positive interest rate, an interest rate of 3%. And then we're assuming that when you graduate from college, that sum of money that you owe can be treated like a lump sum mortgage, and that the taxes you pay every month are like your payment on a house on a mortgage. So part of the payment you're repaying the principal, and part of the payment is repaying the interest. And we can calculate how many years you would have to work earning the average wage and paying the average share of taxes before you had paid back what has been spent on you. Okay. And Ron Lee and some co-authors have done this calculation. It's very approximate, pretty crude, but it's still pretty startling. It takes you about 17 years before you have paid that back. And guess what? After you've paid that back, It's not long before you're going to start be thinking about retirement, and then the income direction, that flow is going to reverse direction again. So it would be really interesting to have more accurate calculations and to know across differences in the income distribution and across gender differences and across racial ethnic differences, what are the net flows from government and to government over the life cycle. And it's also a question that it's quite relevant to thinking about the sustainability of Medicare and Social Security expenditures. So it's not, you know, the political valence is not limited to my somewhat self-indulgent rag on, you know, tax freedom day. You could also spin it in a very different political direction. So yeah, I think I'll just stop there because I think that gives us plenty to talk about. There's some other slides here that maybe I'll just mention. I do actually, there is a lot of empirical content to an accounting model like this. There are ways to plug in the numbers, and I've done a little bit of work with the American Time Use Survey and the Child Development Survey of the PSID, and the Health and Retirement Survey also has some, something I'd be familiar with, also has some potential to plug into the overall accounting model. So I think it's a really rich agenda for both, you know, just understanding the accounting model, setting up the accounting model, filling in some of the blanks in the accounting model, and then asking, you know, how does that affect our perceptions of people's well-being and how it's changing over time. So I hope I've persuaded some of you that accounting is actually much more interesting than you probably would have especially this time of year when you're probably working on your internet. Thank you very much.